He gave the company 17 years of his life. He carried the sales floor for 3 years straight, working weekends while his little girl slept over at her grandmother's house. And when the chairman finally had a chair to give away, he gave it to his own daughter instead, a woman who had never once closed a deal on her own. If you have ever poured everything you had into a place that still chose someone else, stay with me until the end, because what this man built after he walked out that door will make you want to hit like on this video and subscribe to this channel right now, so you never miss a story like this one again. David Turner was 38 years old, and for the last 3 years running, his name had sat at the very top of the leaderboard that hung on the wall outside the executive suite of Sterling Industrial Supply. Top seller 2024, top seller 2025, top seller 2026. 3 brass plaques, 3 years of 80-hour weeks, 3 years of missed dinners and rescheduled bedtime stories, and one small girl named Lily who had learned to fall asleep to the sound of her father's fizz voice on speakerphone, telling her about his day from a hotel room 3 states away. David had not planned on being a single father. His wife Angela had left when Lily was 4, unable to handle the long nights and the uncertainty of commission-based income, unable to handle a husband who was, in her words, always somewhere else even when he was standing right in front of her. She had not been entirely wrong, but David had made a promise to himself the night she packed her bags. He would never let his daughter feel unloved, unseen, or unimportant, even if it meant carrying 2 lives on one set of shoulders. So he worked. He worked harder than any man in that building had ever worked, because every commission check was not just a number on a paycheck. It was piano lessons. It was new shoes that fit. It was a birthday party with a bounce house instead of an apology. Sterling Industrial Supply was not a glamorous company. It sold steel fasteners, industrial adhesives, and specialty hardware to manufacturing plants across the Midwest. The kind of unglamorous, unsexy business that quietly made billions of dollars a year while nobody outside the industry ever noticed it existed. But David had fallen in love with it the moment he walked through its doors as a 21-year-old warehouse associate, fresh out of community college, with a business degree and no connections to speak of. He had started in the loading dock, moved to inside sales within a year, and by his 10th year with the company, he had built a client book so loyal that plant managers across 4 states would not take a call from anyone else. He knew their kids' names. He knew which ones needed net 60 terms during a rough quarter, and which ones just needed someone to listen for 10 minutes before they'd sign anything. He was not just a salesman. He was, in the truest sense, a partner to every single one of his accounts. Richard Sterling, the company's founder and chairman, had built Sterling Industrial from a single truck and a handshake back in 1988. He was 71 years old now, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and fiercely proud of the empire he had built from nothing. He respected David. Everyone respected David. And for years, the unspoken understanding on the sales floor was that when Richard finally stepped back from day-to-day operations and named a vice president of sales, the corner office with David's name on the door was only a matter of time. David had earned it in every measurable way a man could earn something. The numbers did not lie. The client retention did not lie. The 3 brass plaques on the wall did not lie. But numbers, it turned out, were not the only thing that mattered in a family-owned business. Vanessa Sterling was 31 years old, Richard's only child, a graduate of a well-regarded business school back east. And for the past 2 years she had been rotating quietly through different departments of her father's company, marketing for 6 months, operations for 8, and finally, 12 months in a junior sales role that had, by every honest account among the staff, been quietly padded and protected by executives who understood exactly whose daughter she was. She was not a bad person. She was intelligent, and she worked hard in her own way, and she genuinely wanted to prove herself. But she had never once, not a single time, walked into a cold manufacturing plant at 6 in the morning and waited 2 hours in a lobby just for the chance to shake a purchasing manager's hand. She had never eaten a gas station sandwich in a truck at midnight because it was the only thing open between 2 client visits. She had never closed a deal that saved a family-owned plant from bankruptcy, the way David had done for the Hendrickson family in Ohio, the way he still thought about sometimes, late at night, with quiet pride. David still remembered his first week on the loading dock like it was yesterday. He had been 21, wearing steel-toed boots 2 sizes too big because they were the only pair the warehouse had left in stock, hauling pallets of galvanized bolts in the July heat, while sweat soaked through his shirt by 9 in the morning. The dock supervisor at the time, a gruff old-timer named Pete Alvarez, had pulled him aside on his 3rd day and told him something David never forgot. "Kid, this business isn't about the steel. Steel's steel. Anybody can sell steel. This business is about whether the man on the other end of the phone believes you'd still pick up when something goes wrong. That's the whole game." David had carried that sentence with him for 17 years, through every cold call, every canceled vacation, every 2 a.m. phone call from a panicked plant manager whose line had gone down. He had built his entire career on the simple, unglamorous discipline of being the man who picked up the phone. The morning the announcement came, David had been in the building since 6:30, reviewing quarterly numbers for the 4th quarter push. He was called into the executive conference room at 10 o'clock along with the rest of the senior sales staff. Richard Sterling stood at the head of the long mahogany table, and David remembers the way the older man's eyes would not quite meet his when he began to speak. "After a great deal of thought," Richard said, "I've decided to name Vanessa as the new vice president of sales, effective the 1st of next month." The room did not gasp. It did the thing that rooms full of professional adults do when something deeply unfair happens. In front of them, it went very, very quiet, and a few pairs of eyes flicked toward David and then quickly away, as though looking directly at him for too long might make the injustice contagious. David sat perfectly still. He did not stand up. He did not argue. 17 years of discipline held his spine straight and his face composed, even as something inside his chest cracked clean down the middle. Vanessa, to her credit, looked uncomfortable. She glanced at David once, an apology forming somewhere behind her eyes that she did not have the courage or the standing to say out loud in that room. Richard cleared his throat and moved on to discuss transition timelines as though he had simply announced a scheduling change and not upended the professional future of the man who had single-handedly kept the company's largest accounts loyal through 2 recessions. After the meeting, Richard asked David to stay behind. When the room had emptied, the old man finally looked at him directly. "David," he said, "you know this isn't about your numbers. Your numbers are the best this company has ever seen. This is about legacy. This is about family. I built this company so that one day it would belong to my blood. I hope you can understand that, even if you can't agree with it." David listened. He had always been a good listener. It was, after all, the thing that had made him the best salesman this company had ever had. And when Richard finished speaking, David nodded once, stood up, straightened his jacket, and said the only thing that felt true in that moment, "I understand completely, Richard. It's your company. It was always going to be your company. I think I forgot that for a while." He paused at the door. "I'll have my resignation letter on your desk by Friday." Richard's face went pale. "David, you don't have to do that. There's still a place for you here. A generous package, a senior advisory role, whatever title I don't want a consolation prize," David said, not unkindly, but with a finality that surprised even himself. "I gave this place everything I had for 17 years because I believed that if I worked hard enough, and I was honest enough, and I took care of people the right way, it would be enough. Today I learned it isn't enough. Not here. And I have a daughter at home who's watching how her father responds when life isn't fair to him. I owe it to her to show her what dignity looks like." He walked out of that conference room and did not look back. The weeks that followed were harder than David had expected, and he had expected them to be very hard. His last paycheck from Sterling Industrial covered the mortgage for 2 more months and not a day longer. He had savings, but not the kind of savings that 17 years at a company should have built, because every extra dollar for the last 8 years had gone toward Lily, her school, her ballet lessons, the trip to see her mother's family in Arizona that Angela had asked him to fund because she couldn't swing it this year. David did not regret a cent of it, but sitting at his kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, staring at a spreadsheet of dwindling numbers while Lily slept upstairs, he felt something close to real fear for the first time in a long time. He sent out resumes. He had interviews with 3 competitors, all of whom respected his track record enormously, and all of whom, in the end, offered him roughly 70% of what he'd made at Sterling. Because, as one hiring manager put it almost apologetically, your book of business is tied to Sterling's product line, David. Without their catalog behind you, some of that value doesn't transfer as cleanly as you'd think. It was a polite way of saying that David's 17 years of relationships were, in the eyes of the corporate world, an asset that belonged more to the company than to the man who built them. One of those interviews stayed with David longer than the others. It was with a competitor 2 towns over, a company nearly as large as Sterling, and the interviewer, a polished woman in her 40s, had looked over his resume with genuine admiration before sliding it back across the table. David, on paper you're the best candidate I've seen in 5 years. Off paper, I have to ask, if a company with Sterling's reputation and resources decided you weren't worth the top seat, what does that tell the market about you? Fair or not? David had sat with that question the whole drive home, hands tight on the steering wheel, Lily's soccer cleats rattling in the back seat, where he'd forgotten to move them for a week. It was not a fair question, but it was, he realized, the exact question the entire industry would quietly be asking about. And for, as long as he kept trying to walk back through someone else's front door. That realization sat with David for 3 sleepless nights, and on the 4th night, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom at 2 in the morning, something shifted. If his relationships were his real value, not Sterling's catalog, not Sterling's warehouse, not Sterling's name on a business card, then why was he trying to sell himself back into someone else's catalog, company? Why not build the company himself? The idea terrified him. He had a daughter. He had a mortgage. He had exactly 4 months of runway left in his savings account. Starting a business from nothing, in an industry as unglamorous and relationship-driven as industrial hardware distribution, was the kind of decision that ruined men far more reckless than David Turner had ever been in his life. But he thought about the Hendrickson plant in Ohio. He thought about the dozens of plant managers who had told him, over the years, in their own gruff and unsentimental way, that they trusted him more than they trusted the company he worked for. He picked up his phone and, at 2:15 in the morning, he began writing a list of every single client who had ever told him that. There were 31 names on that list by sunrise. David founded Turner Fastening Solutions 3 weeks later, out of a rented 600-square-foot office above a laundromat, with $11,000 of remaining savings, a laptop, a company cell phone plan, and a handshake agreement with a small regional supplier who agreed to extend him 30-day terms because the supplier's owner, a woman named Carol Weiss, had known David for a decade and told him flatly, "If Sterling was foolish enough to let you go, I'd be a fool not to bet on you." That single sentence became the foundation David built everything else on top of. The first year was brutal. David called every one of those 31 names personally. 8 of them were still under long-term contracts with Sterling and couldn't move. Not yet. But they promised to call the moment those contracts expired. 11 of them said yes on the spot, transferring their business almost entirely on the starts. Strength of the relationship David had built with them over years. Not because Turner Fastening Solutions had a fancier catalog or lower prices. It had neither. The remaining 12 took more convincing, more late-night phone calls, more Saturday morning visits to plants that David drove 3 hours to reach because he refused to let a client feel like a number the way he once had. He worked even harder than he had at Sterling, which Lily, now 11, noticed immediately and did not always appreciate. There were nights David missed her school recitals because a shipment was delayed, and a client was furious, and David refused to let anyone else handle that conversation. There were mornings he made her breakfast with his phone wedged between his ear and shoulder, negotiating freight costs before 7 a.m. But there was a difference this time, and Lily, sharp as her father, felt it even if she couldn't quite name it. This time, when her father worked late, he was building something that had his name on it. This time, the sacrifices were not disappearing into someone else's company. They were becoming something that belonged to their family. By the end of year 1, Turner Fastening Solutions had done $410,000 in revenue. Nothing spectacular in the industry, but enough to cover payroll for the 2 employees David had hired, enough to keep the lights on, enough to prove the bet was not insane. By the end of year 2, that number had grown to just over $2 million, driven largely by word of mouth among plant managers who talked to each other more than corporate executives ever gave them credit for. David had hired 6 employees by then, rented a proper warehouse, and, in a twist that still made him smile when he thought about it, hired away Sterling Industrial's second-best salesman, a quiet, methodical man named Marcus Webb, who had grown tired of watching a boardroom reward blood over performance. Marcus Webb's decision to leave Sterling had come after a similarly quiet injustice. A territory he had built over 9 years, reassigned overnight to a nephew of one of the regional directors, with no explanation offered beyond restructuring. When Marcus called David to ask, almost sheepishly, whether Turner Fastening Solutions might have room for one more salesman, David didn't hesitate. He drove out to meet Marcus in person that same week, sat across from him at a diner booth, and told him plainly, "I'm not going to promise you a title you haven't earned yet, and I'm not going to promise you it'll be easy, but I will promise you that here, the only thing that decides your future is the work you actually do." Marcus signed on the following Monday, and within a year he had rebuilt nearly his entire old territory under Turner's banner, plant by plant, phone call by phone call, proof that the relationships David had always believed in were never really about company logos in the first place. It was somewhere in the middle of year 3 that David got the call that changed everything. The Hendrickson plant in Ohio, the very account David had saved from bankruptcy years earlier, the account he still thought about with quiet pride, was up for a massive contract renewal. Their existing supplier was Sterling Industrial Supply, and under Vanessa Sterling's leadership, the relationship had frayed badly. Response times had slipped. A shipment error had cost Hendrickson nearly $60,000 in downtime the previous spring, and Vanessa, by all accounts, had handled the fallout defensively rather than personally, sending a junior account manager to smooth things over instead of showing up herself. Old man Hendrickson, 78 years old, and as blunt as David remembered him, called David directly. "Son," he said, "I heard you started your own outfit. I should have called you the day you left that place. You interested in a 120,000 unit annual contract? Or has Sterling already got your loyalty locked up somewhere else?" David closed that deal in 11 days. It was, at the time, the single largest contract in Turner Fastening Solutions' short history, and it sent a very clear message through the entire regional industrial supply market. The best salesman Sterling Industrial had ever employed was no longer just surviving on his own. He was thriving, and he was starting to take back, piece by piece, exactly what had once been taken from him. Word of the Hendrickson deal reached Richard Sterling within the week. David heard, secondhand, through Carol Weiss, that the old chairman had gone unusually quiet in a leadership meeting when the news came up, that he'd sat staring at the wall for a long moment before simply saying, "We should never have let that man walk out the door." It was the closest thing to an apology David would hear for a long time. And honestly, by then, David didn't need it anymore. He had stopped needing Richard Sterling's validation the day old man Hendrickson called him son over the phone, and meant it more sincerely than Richard Sterling ever had in 17 years. 3 years to the month after David had walked out of that conference room with his resignation letter in hand, Turner Fastening Solutions crossed $9 million in annual revenue. David now employed 22 people, 4 of whom had left Sterling Industrial to join him. Not because he had poached them aggressively, but because his reputation for treating people fairly had traveled through the industry the same way his sales reputation once had. He had bought a modest but comfortable house with a real backyard, the first Lily had ever had. He coached her middle school volleyball team on Tuesday evenings, a schedule slot he protected more fiercely than any client meeting, because he had learned, the hard way, exactly what it cost to build a life around a company that would never truly build anything back for him in return. And then, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in October, David's assistant told him a Sterling Industrial representative was in the lobby requesting a meeting. David nearly laughed out loud when he saw who it was. It was Vanessa Sterling. She looked different than she had 3 years earlier, thinner, more tired, dressed in a suit that seemed to carry more weight than fabric should. She sat across from David's desk, in the small but growing office of the company he had built out, of $11,000, and a list of 31 names, and for a long moment, she simply looked around at the framed photo of Lily on David's bookshelf, the wall of thank you letters from clients, the modest but unmistakable evidence of something built honestly from the ground up. She did not try to pretend the last 3 years hadn't happened. "I'm not here to ask you to come back," she said. "I know that ship has sailed, and honestly, I don't think my father would even survive the humility of asking. I'm here because Sterling Industrial lost 4 major accounts this year, including 2 I inherited directly from my father, and our board is asking questions I don't have good answers for. I've spent 3 years trying to prove I deserve that title, and the truth is, David, I don't think I ever really understood what the job actually required until it was too late to learn it the easy way. You didn't lose those accounts because Sterling had a better catalog than you. You built them because you actually cared about the people on the other end of the phone. I never learned how to do that. I'm not sure it's something you can learn from a business school textbook." David listened, the way he had always listened, the skill that had built his entire career. "I'm not going to pretend the last 3 years didn't hurt," he said finally. "But I'm also not going to pretend I regret a single day of them, because they taught me something your father's boardroom never could have. That the value I built over 17 years was never really his to give away or take back. It was mine the whole time. I just needed someone to remind me of that the hard way." He paused, and something in his expression softened, because whatever else was true, Vanessa, Sterling was still a young woman trying to find her footing in an impossible situation her father had created for her, not entirely her own doing. "I'm not interested in a merger, and I'm not interested in going back," David continued. "But I'll tell you what I am interested in. Hendrickson still respects your father, believe it or not. There are ways to rebuild trust in this industry, but it starts with showing up in person, not sending someone else to clean up your mistakes. If you're serious about learning this business the real way, I'll have coffee with you once a month and tell you exactly what I know. Not because I owe your family anything, but because somebody showed me kindness when I had nothing, and I think that's worth passing forward, even to people who once had a hand in taking everything I'd built." Vanessa's eyes filled, and she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. It was not the outcome either of them could have predicted 3 years earlier, in that quiet, uncomfortable conference room. It was not revenge, and it was not forgiveness in the simple sense either. It was something more complicated and more honest than either of those things. 2 people, on opposite sides of an old injustice, finding a way forward that did not require anyone to lose again. That evening, David picked Lily up from volleyball practice, and as they drove home together, with the windows cracked and the autumn air pouring in, she asked him, the way 14-year-olds sometimes do, out of nowhere, whether he was ever angry that the chairman chose his daughter over him all those years ago. David thought about it for a long moment before he answered. "I was angry for a while," he said honestly, "but I think the chairman actually did me the biggest favor of my whole career. Even though he never meant to. He showed me that the things I built, the trust, the relationships, the reputation, those were never really his company's to give me credit for or take away from me. They were mine. I just had to walk out that door to find out." Lily was quiet for a moment, watching the houses go by. She thought about her own life too, the years of hotel room phone calls and missed recitals, and how different the last 3 years had felt, even with all their long hours, because this time the tiredness in her father's eyes came with a kind of pride she hadn't seen in him before. "So getting passed over was actually the best thing that happened to you?" David smiled, the kind of smile that had taken 3 hard years to earn honestly. "The best things that happen to us don't usually feel like gifts when they're happening," he said. "Sometimes they feel like the floor dropping out from under you. But if you keep your feet under yourself long enough, and you keep showing up with the same honesty and the same hard work no matter who's watching, the floor you land on ends up being one you built yourself. And nobody, not a chairman, not a board, not anybody, can hand that to you. And nobody can ever take it away from you either." They pulled into the driveway of the house with the real backyard, the one Lily still sometimes couldn't quite believe was theirs, and before they went inside, David sat with her for a moment longer in the quiet of the car. "I want you to remember something," he told her. "Not the part about the chairman or the company or any of that. I want you to remember that your dad got knocked down about as hard as a person can get knocked down, and instead of staying down or spending years being bitter about it, he got back up and built something better. Not because I was smarter than anyone else, and not because I was luckier, just because I refused to let one unfair decision be the last word on who I was. You're going to get your own version of that conference room someday, Lily. Everybody does. And when you do, I want you to remember that the floor dropping out from under you isn't the end of the story. It's just the part where you find out what you're really made of. If David Turner's story taught us anything tonight, it's that being overlooked is never the end of your story. Sometimes it's simply the moment your real story finally begins. If this journey moved you even a little, make sure you've hit that subscribe button, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and share this with someone who needs to hear tonight that their hardest chapter might just be building the foundation for their greatest one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.